And I always like the way Todd Caldwell described the forecast period. He says the forecast period is like a big tuba bell. The further out you go, the wider the chance that the data actually can lie in uh, based on your assumptions. What are you going to model for forest products? Saw timber, pulpwood, or something more general like growing stock, biomass, or carbon? What's your available data? One of the more critical ones within the model is how you're going to stratify. How many different forest types are you going to recognize? Within forest types, how many different crown closure or size classes you're going to think about? Are you going to partition by a landowner group? Each of these creates a need for, in Woodstock terms, creates a need for a yield curve. So for instance, if you have 5 forest types, 4 owner groups, 3 age classes, and 5 silvicultural treatments, you're up to about 250 yield curves that you have to design in order to accurately track how the model transitions over time. One of the harder parts that I've seen with models is how to initiate regeneration. There's not a good construct for what happens when I partially cut a stand in my model, clear cut a stand, and then how many different scenarios are you going to treat? Business as usual, an increased harvest, maintain inventory levels, introduce a spruce budworm epidemic or hemlock woolly adelgid. And the last thought I want to bring to mind is the level of detail. Are you going to do this on just a statewide application? Break it down somehow into regions, or what the Maine Forest Service calls mega regions, which are aggregates of counties? Or look at a more ecological type land division like Bailey's ecological subsections or provinces. So there's a lot of decisions to make in building a model. They all have impacts because some of them are based on data, some of them are based on assumptions of what you think might happen. So with that, I'll take any follow-up questions.
Ken, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Really?
Hey.
Great. Well, I've had multiple struggles to just try to get on the audio. You basically covered the things that I was going to mention for the benefit of non-modelers about the kind of things that have to be set up. And all I would add would be, I'm not sure you mentioned this, but one of the questions is, do I do economic optimizing or not? And that has to do with the goal of the model. Am I trying to do harvest scheduling? Am I trying to maximize inventory? Am I trying to maximize the harvest over a period of time? Some of these models give you a lot of flexibility in how you choose objectives. But I think what Ken's quote tells us is really true, and that is that the model helps you understand how the system works. It helps you characterize a system. And if you can, in a careful and thoughtful way, do like what if analyses, you can say, well, why did this model give us the prediction that it gave us? Was it because it used an incorrect, an estimate of future harvest that turned out to be off the base? You can use it to diagnose your understanding and your data. So I guess I was naive when I started this because I thought, well, I'll just assemble all of these reports and we'll put them in a Dropbox for you on the website so you can look at them yourself. And then we'll compare them, and maybe that'll give us an idea of why the results were different. And that would be kind of interesting by itself. But it turns out, as Ken has shown you with those charts, in the past, our forecasting record hasn't been so good. That makes me feel better because a lot of my forecasts haven't been very good either. And it also meant that for the most recent 3 or 4 of them, we don't really have a good way to stand them next to one another and compare. But I hope that we can get a part of the way toward that. And especially the one Jereme has his work together, we'll be able to look at the most recent models anyway and get a sense for what the strengths and weaknesses are of the different modeling systems. Because right now it's very hard to judge.
Ken, this is Denny Gallaudet. Could I ask a question?
Sure.
I was fascinated by the conversation at the Climate Council meeting this last week, particularly when the EPA folks or DEP folks got on and started talking about trying to estimate carbon emissions from wood burning or biomass. It was a pretty heated discussion towards the end of the presentation. And I just wondered if, they seem to be struggling with really being able to get good data on what carbon emissions are released from biomass burning. And they referred to a report that they require of the mills and other producers to voluntarily submit. And the only corroborating data that they mentioned was the wood harvesting report that's put out by the Maine Forest Service. So I just wondered what you might know about the quality of the information we have on actual biomass or carbon released by burning wood in the state of Maine.
Never had the chance to look at that, Denny. I've always dealt with just the raw material that shows up.
Yeah. It sounds like it's going to be an important policy item going forward because it could be a constraint on the wood products industry. If the people don't understand or trust the carbon emissions data that we're working with, because that all is very relevant to the 2045 goal for carbon neutrality.
I wonder if we might, Denny, maybe if there's interest, we have a session on that for this group at some point in the future. Would that be of interest?
Well, it would be to me, obviously, but I just was, I thought the DEP had a lot more information about the thing than they really admitted. And so it's going to be.
Well, we'll get them to come talk to us then.
Yeah.
How's that? I wanted to go back, if I could go back and ask Ken, and really all of you that know more than me about this, maybe Peter T would be good. How do you, if you had this inventory modeling, how would you as a landowner think about using it? Would you treat it with a grain of salt, or how could you use it in your decision making, or is it, or
I can
yeah,
weigh in on that because I've been doing modeling for clients, including Huber, for years. You always bear in mind what Ken said, right? All the models are wrong. And I learned that not the hard way, but remember Ken will remember, I was with Sewell Company when they did the wood supply analysis in the 80s, and we predicted the last stick of spruce and fir were going to be cut about 10 years ago. And look what happened, right? But models are better than they were. And individual landowners can build yield curves in situations that are tailored to their land base and are actually built on the management decisions they expect to make versus just assumptions that are made at some public level. And it's also important to bear in mind that there's a big difference between doing a simulating a forest, and doing an optimization, which Ken mentioned a minute ago. So when I'm modeling forests for my clients, we're optimizing. We're going to optimize certain things. I might want to optimize a terminal inventory or optimize harvest levels within the constraints of not allowing an inventory to fall below a level. And you get your linear programming thing going there, and it'll come up with an optimal solution, which you need to look at carefully and make sure it hasn't gone overboard on you. But versus a simulation, it's more of a spreadsheet exercise, more or less, and takes what you know and just projects it forward in time without trying to optimize it. And you tend to get very different results when you do that. And I don't, Ken can comment as to whether that's behind some of the differences in those models that he was showing, or whether it was just assumptions. But anyway, that's the very short answer about how we use models in the private world for clients.
That's
And,
an interesting distinction. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Peter. Ken, any thoughts about, because you're using FIA data, whereas Peter T might be using his own inventory data from the particular land base, probably much more dense
Yep.
array of points.
Yep.
So yeah, I could see the difference.
And I might know that, you know, if we do a shelterwood entry, we know that in 15 years, we're going to do an overstory removal. And we've, you know, we expect that certain things to happen because we've documented it. So we have a much more robust set of yield curves because they're designed for our particular ownership.
Mm-hmm.
It might not work very well for somebody else. You know, you got to tailor it that way. But it's
So-
harder when you're doing a statewide analysis. You have to make assumptions about what everybody's doing, and that's harder.
So you could you write you might manage one piece of land more towards a pulpwood forest and another land base more for saw timber. That's the optimization difference you were talking about. Is that right?
Right. I mean, I have clients that for them, the whole gig is, I mean, they want to be in the black. They want to make money, but what they're really focused on is building an inventory for 2 generations out. This is the way of storing and building wealth for a couple of generations out. Well, that's a different set of objectives and a different optimization than a landowner that might say, I just want to hold my inventory steady. I want to maximize cash flows within that constraint.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how does that work?
A thought occurs to me on that. One of the things Peter is saying, that a difference between when he models for a landowner and when we try to do simulations for the state as a whole is that the landowner is presumably in control of how much they cut.
Okay.
They can make that choice based on policy, finance, whatever their criteria are. They can decide we will harvest and sell so much wood every year. Whereas for the state, if we're going to project it out to the future, we just have to make some assumptions. We're based on, well, what was the average of the last couple of years, or what do you think is going to happen, or what is the forecast? And so that's a pretty significant difference right there. And it may be the differences about assumptions about the future harvest underlie some of the differences between these forecasts. One more observation, just from experience, when it comes to bad forecasts, I was not the forecaster at the time, but a number of us remember the budworm days. And I have often asked the forecasters, it seems to me that we were presented with forecasts in the mid to late 70s, early 80s that overestimated the total losses we were going to end up with the budworm outbreak. It turned out it was nowhere near as bad as that. And that may be underlying what Peter is speaking of, where the forecasts were saying we're just plain going to run out. But I don't remember what the answer was, but that was an example where this was highly policy relevant. How bad would it be if we do nothing? And yet the modeling at the time, the databases we had at the time, and the assumptions we had to make at the time had us painting a much more stark picture than what actually emerged. And it wasn't because we kept spraying, because we were cutting back on spraying. The outbreak was milder than we had expected, even in the face of cutting back on spraying.
Well,
I'm very curious about this, the optimization thing that Peter is talking about, and then the projections. You know, I've done a lot of optimization. It used to be it was hardwired. You could optimize for different things. When you got an answer, you did sensitivity tests. I was always curious to see the near misses. You know, they would give you to the penny, it would give you it would give you an answer. So I always wanted to see sort of the 20 nearest answers to see if something was wildly different. It's sort of like sighting in a rifle. You know, if all the shots kind of fall in the same place, then it's okay. If one of them's way off, then you need to know that. Some completely different set of management steps might yield you something very close to what you said you wanted. And in the meantime, models have improved so that you can give them, instead of being hardwired, if you do this, you get that. You put in, if I do this, I stand a 60% chance of getting that. You can put in that variable to say, it's not for certain, it is close to, and that helps with the accuracy. I'm curious that this optimization, if we're trying to talk about carbon or something else, have any of these optimizations been run at a statewide basis rather than a landowner basis?
yes. I'm going to talk about a high level one that we worked on for Maine.
Okay, so that's the same concept of the optimization on different things, sensitivity testings and all that. Okay,
Yep.
that would be very interesting to hear in relation to this other thing of just projecting in with these sort of generalized assumptions about what might happen. How close those two come together would be very interesting to know.
So a question for Adam, since he's there and he didn't want to talk today, but I'm sorry. I mean, Adam, when you do your kind of modeling that you've done recently, you're looking at the statewide level, not a landowner level, and you're also focused on large scale policy questions that people are struggling with, which is different from, say, what Peter T. might need to do for optimization for a landowner. I guess I had never really appreciated the distinction between and the different purposes in those two types. They're all modeling, but for different ends. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the key, is every model has its strength, everyone has its weakness, right? And so you want to probably, stand level, you do want to optimize, right? And people have different objectives. And I think that's, we're at the landscape level, you can try to control for that. So you can control for different ownership classes, act differently. You can, based on what your growing stock is, you might react differently. But you still ultimately it ultimately comes up with the model or choose for the objective or some way that what you're trying to meet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So each model, the way you do that also has to be specified differently.
Mm-hmm.
So Landis, you have to actually specify harvest area. You don't specify an inventory. Like, that's basically the objective that you want to do, is like basically harvest a certain amount of area, and then it chooses where to harvest to do that, which is a lot different from a lot of other models that it's more like, maximize inventory or reach some right, or maximize cash flow or something like that, right? But that's sort of how that model can operate from that level. The question, I guess, turning to that I had for Ken, because the projections were off and all projections are off. Do you have any insight on how much it was a demand-driven thing versus a supply-driven? So, was just the modeling not good at estimating growth and yield? Or was it more that, projections of what demand for pulpwood would be over the future were just way off because markets changed and we didn't have the ability the foresight from that perspective?
Combination, Adam.
Yeah.
Landowners change their behavior in terms of harvest practices. The budworm ended up not being as severe on the spruce fir resource as we anticipated. And the growth projections were probably, in looking with Backsight, the growth projections were way below what we've experienced over the last 20 years. So it's a combination of impacts that, are, I don't want to say they're all additive, but they all have an impact.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought. So you gave the answer that I perceived, is that it's all of the above and drive that, right? And particularly if they're all trending opposite of what you assumed, right? Then that makes the error look even larger. But
the single biggest driver of the budworm error models, the ones that I was working on, was that we had no way of knowing, and we just couldn't make a gross assumption that mills would stop using so much spruce fir and switch to hardwood.
Mm-hmm.
So we were assuming the consumption was going to stay just the way it was. It wasn't going to change. And of course, people that run big facilities aren't stupid, and they saw what was happening with the budworm, and they said, geez, I wonder if we can use all this hardwood stuff that nobody's ever wanted before. And they all switched. And it made a huge difference in how the inventories reacted. And I just want to make one quick comment about the budworm. Everybody's saying it wasn't so bad. It was awful. It was horrible. Millions of acres were dead. It was terrible.
Yeah. And I guess that's my last comment before we move on, is that, models are really hard at we have to be, as modelers, we have to have the foresight to understand how people can actually adapt to conditions, right? And we have to make assumptions, right? So it's coming exactly what Peter just said, is that if we were modelers and knew how to do that, then I would have just invested in a mill, right? Or been a mill manager instead of a model, right? Because I would have had the foresight to do it. So that's the other thing, is that it's really hard to account for innovation that is outside the sphere of what you're thinking, right? And so some models are better than others at sort of simulating sort of changes based on, price, like just use price as a proxy, but not actually say, well, we're going to change the silviculture. But, the way I think about it in another model I work on, it's that as timber prices go up, people tend to invest more in forest management. Now, that model won't tell you exactly if they're going to shift to more shelter woods or whatever, but you can at least get that sort of relationship that you might get higher yields because of a market driven effect. But again, it's not going to tell you what, so that's not that useful for other perspectives.
I think this would be a good time to get Peter to tell us about the 4-main modeling that he's already mentioned and bring us up to speed on that, and especially on what they expect to be doing with that process in the near future.
Sure. Is everybody familiar with what 4-main is? Should I do like a quick 2-minute what the heck 4-main is before I get into what we did for modeling?
Please do.
All right. So and I've got a couple of different screens with numbers and things like that. So if I'm not looking at your screen, that's because I'm looking at other stuff. So 4-main is a collaborative effort to chart the future of the forest products industry in Maine. I won't get into the genesis of it. It goes back a ways, but it's funded by the federal government as well as money from the state and private money. The coalition includes pretty much all of the industry, from professional loggers, Maine Forest Products Council, all the folks you'd imagine, the state of Maine, the Maine Forest Service, and DECD. The University of Maine is a big player. The feds, mostly through our delegation and the fact that they've provided funding, and the communities in which the industry is embedded. They're represented there too. The goal, which may seem a bit unrealistic, but I'm not so sure that it is to grow the economy, the forest products economy, from contributing what it does now, which is roughly $8 billion a year to the state, to $12 billion, so somewhere over the next 10 years. And I guess it's doable. It also has studies, international groups actually that have been doing studies to see where Maine is the most competitive in terms of forest products. There's a huge array, as we all know, of forest products out there, and we're competitive in some and not in others. I won't get into all of those, but if you want to ask me questions later, I can. I've got some of that information. We were asked to analyze wood supply, how much excess, if any, fiber was available based on current consumption, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then actually get into investor attraction, talking to companies that might want to come and invest here to build facilities. So what we did, Ken was part of it, and Jeremy's part of the phase 2 that we're working on, so they can chime in too. As I said, we were asked to model wood supply in the state of Maine, and where there may be surpluses. I want to state from the very beginning that it was a very high level exercise, right? Anybody that's going to come and invest multiple hundreds of millions of dollars in a facility is going to do their own wood supply analysis for the area where they're going to locate a mill. We were just providing data for these consulting groups to work with and say, it looks like we have something like this available for people to use for fiber. We did an optimization, and I'll explain how in a minute. And what we sought to do is, by the major species groups, and I'll get into more details in a minute, by the major species groups, figure out through optimization what would be the maximum sustainable harvest level for those species groups, and then compare it to what current consumption is. And we did it for spruce fir, the dense hardwoods, aspen, pine, other softwood, and cedar. And I'm going to concentrate on the dense hardwoods and spruce fir because they're the biggest components, and they were the ones with the biggest delta. The others were all kind of in balance. The contractor was Sewell Company. Dave Stevens and Ernest Bowling were the main people working on it. Ernest took the FIA data. He started with that as the inventory, and that's how he calibrated it and built yield curves along the lines of what Ken was talking about to simulate a relatively simple management regime. Mostly it was shelterwood management, which is relatively even aged, shelterwood entries, overstory removals, intermediate thinnings. We broke those out as Ken was describing. We did it by the mega regions in the state, and by the major landowner groups, which includes, public, feds, large landowners, small landowners. We excluded highly regulated areas, so deer wintering areas, high elevation areas, the places where timber management is allowed to occur, but that's not the primary purpose of that land. So that we just pull those acres right out. And so we asked the model to come up with, you know, as I said, how do we maximize harvest levels, but at the end of the 50-year projection have as much or more inventory than we started with for that species group. And then when we got done doing that, that was an optimization exercise. We looked at it and said, well, okay, we have to apply some discounts here. They're going to be somewhat arbitrary, but we can't expect all these landowner classes to maximize their harvest levels. So for example, for federal lands, we just discounted the output from them 100%. We assume there would be no volume coming from them. For the other public lands, which is mostly the state lands, we discounted that by 30%. Small landowners in southern Maine, we discounted by 50%, which is pretty high because there's a lot of timber harvesting down there, but a lot of their pulpwood and the hardwood side, this is mostly for the small landowner one is for hardwood. A lot of their pulpwood is oak, which the mills don't really want. So we discounted by 50% in the south, by 20% elsewhere for them. And for large landowners, we didn't discount at all. And the short answer of what we came up with, I can answer detailed questions if people want to ask, is that we have a considerable surplus of spruce fir fiber. Anybody who's working in the industry would not be surprised by that, to the tune of 3 million tons per year. That's currently not being used. That's accumulating volume, and the FIA data shows that, you know, growth is exceeding harvest by a big margin. And we, even though the state uses a lot of hardwood, we have a certain amount of hardwood surplus as well, somewhere between 2 and 3 million tons per year. However, unlike spruce fir, which is concentrated on the large ownerships, a lot of that extra surplus hardwood would have to come off of small landowners. So that's a little bit more of a, and you're making some iffier assumptions there, assuming that what's going to come off of there. But we handed that results to the larger group, who then gave it to the big consultants to work with. It's, the short answer is we have, it's a smaller number. We have a surplus of other softwood, pulpwood, pine and hemlock mostly. And we have a surplus, a large surplus of spruce fir and also one of hardwood. Now, what didn't we do that's important? Any quick questions there before I talk about what we're working on right now to update this stuff? All right, so what we didn't do.
I would have a question. This is Denny Gallaudet.
Sure, yeah, Denny.
So when you say surplus, what surplus over what? Existing inventory?
Over current consumption. So we modeled the sustainable harvest level. So for example, current consumption of spruce fir is roughly 3 million tons per year. The sustainable harvest level is closer to 6. There's a whole lot of fiber there we're not using at the moment. That's accumulating in the forest.
So just to re-mention the Climate Council, they have their hands out for some of that surplus, you know, to take to meet the carbon offset objective. Does that factored into?
No, because I don't know, I'm not closely following what they're doing, but the primary way people are getting at that right now is doing carbon deals, right? You know, people pay to basically tie up some of the inventory in the forest to sequester carbon, right? This is growth over and above current inventory, and usually those carbon deals cover current inventory. So we did not assume this excess growth to be doing anything for carbon, but that isn't what Formain's about. Formain's about the forest products economy, and we're not trying to use this modeling for anything else. Nor are we trying to drive public policy with it. As I said, this is very high level stuff for consultants and potential investors to look at and say, geez, there might be this kind of volume. So if we're going to locate a facility here, let's go do our own analysis to see if that really adds up.
Well, one thing that did get in the Climate Council in its draft, which was reversed in this last session, was the grow the economy from 8 billion to 12 billion, I think was the number, right?
Yep.
Is that the number?
That's right. Yep.
And that was rejected by this last session of the Climate Council, just to show that there's a tension between those two goals out there at the moment. So,
well, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, right? And getting to 12 billion is not going to be easy anyway. So, the two things we did not do in this high-level exercise was model the budworm, which we have been tasked. We've been given the task of doing that. That's much more easily said than done, because we don't know when the budworm. We know the budworm's coming back. That's a given. We don't know when. and we don't know how severe the outbreak will be. And the forest is different now than it was the last time around. If history is any guide, we are due for a mild budworm attack. They tend to be cyclical that way. You get a really big outbreak, a lot of mortality occurs, and then the next one is fairly mild in its impact, and then the one after that is really big. And so we had one in the late 20s, early 30s. Ken, you can correct me. That was huge. And then in the 50s, there was a mild one where there was some defoliation, but net growth never went negative. And then we had the big one of the late 70s, early 80s. We're due for one. So we'll probably try to, and Ernest is talking to Jereme to get some help. We'll probably try to model a mild outbreak and a severe outbreak. As what would that do to timber supplies? How would that affect the numbers we came up with earlier? But we're not going to try to predict what the budworm's going to do because we have no idea. We're just going to put two scenarios out there. And the other thing that we wanted to improve upon.
I think there's a couple of questions related to that. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Good to see you.
Hey, Karen.
Did you take into account any projections for weather changing in weather patterns over a longer period of time, drought or more temperatures or anything like that?
No, we were using FVS and
The
its
growing
outputs.
seasons have changed somewhat.
And well, one of the important things is that when I run my models for my clients, I run them for 100 years. This exercise ran for 50 years. So that's within the rotation age of the forest. So the weather might change. You know, definitely it's changing, and things will happen. But over this time period, I don't think that's the biggest delta in our assumptions of where things can go wrong, frankly. So in any case, we had no way of doing that other than making just simplified assumptions, and we didn't. We may be asked to do that, and we can, but I'm not quite sure. We'll need to inform ourselves with some other data.
Peter, I had sort of a related question. Is there any loss when you say you model going forward, like fire and hemlock woolly adelgid and you know, any other budworm, obviously, or is it simply sort of the biological potential when you say modeled?
Thank you for asking that, Ivan, because I should have remembered to say that. Let me get this out straight. The underlying yield curves in FVS or fiber, if you're using that, are based on measurements over long periods of time from forest plots. So they should, in theory, take into account the normal cycle of, you know, ice storms, what little bit of fire we have, wind events and blowdown, naturally occurring insect infestations. And they do. I mean, we've demonstrated that, but they're not built to do something like the budworm, and they're not built to do something like a really bad invasive. So we're probably being somewhat overly, based on that, being somewhat a little bit optimistic, say on the hemlock availability, which has a surplus because the adelgid is an introduced pest and it has an impact on the species. But other things like fire, drought, stuff like that, if we expect and we might, but if we expect in the near term a huge change in that, then the yield curves won't take that into account. But if the pattern is similar to what we've seen in the past, then the yield curves have that built in.
Great. Okay, thanks.
So that's what we'll do for was there another question?
I had the same thing. I was going to note that because you're using historical data, some of those disturbances are sort of embedded in that.
Right.
So I just want to confirm.
Right. So, but budworm is not, and we're going to need to do. Oh, I'm sorry, Adam.
No, that's it. Carry on, Peter.
Yeah. So I just talked. But budworm, we're going to do a very simplified, very high level. Here's what might happen, and then the other one we wanted to get a little bit of a better focus on how smaller landowners, family woodlot owners, manage their lands, because they don't do the industrial model of large shelter woods and the commercial thinnings and things like that. They just tend not to. They have different objectives, and we had no way of modeling that the first time around. So hence we had those rather large discounts we applied to the results because we knew something, you know, which I think sort of got us there, but that's pretty arbitrary. So one of the subcommittees in the 4 Maine process is a subcommittee of family woodlot owners. It's chaired by Tom Doak, who's the executive director of the Maine Woodland Owners Association, but I will forevermore call them SMOAN because that's what I grew up calling them. And they gave us, they deliberated and came back and gave us harvesting regimes that they think represent what happens on small woodlots, especially in southern Maine. And just very quickly, it's fairly heavy entries once every 40 years or so, on most of it. And then some woodlots get very light entries on a much more frequent basis, so more silviculture occurring. So we Ernest built some yield curves to simulate that, doing a bunch of new FVS runs. And we've got a couple of preliminary runs out. As expected, the output from lands under those management scenarios is lower than from more intensive silviculture that you see on industrial lands, which was good. It told us kind of what we expected to see. I don't know how realistic it is. We'll need to have discussions about what other discounts to apply, but it gives us a little bit more robust picture of what's going on in the state, because it's a little bit better picture of what's going on in small woodlands. And that was the short story of what we're doing with wood supply format.
Does Tom and the team see an opportunity for growth of the southern Maine growth, a larger proportion of the forest economy from the southern Maine forest?
Well, you know, we tend to think of southern Maine as not seeing much management. It actually gets a lot of management, and there's a lot of active forestry that goes on there. But there's a lot of data that show that you could do better forestry in the South. A lot of times the harvesting decisions are, well, not made by a forester, for example. You know, people just decide to, you know, they need some money and they call up somebody to cut some wood, and the wood gets cut. Or, you know, somebody passes away and the next generation either doesn't want the woodlot or sells it, and so whoever buys it's got to cut wood to pay for the land. So I don't mean to imply for a moment that small woodlots are not managed well, but Tom and his group think that we could, through education through the Forest Service and other programs, we could do a better or more optimal job of managing land down there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you look, one of the things we need to think about, especially in a changing climate, right? I mean, southern Maine has a lot of really nice oak forest. That oak forest is there because of human intervention mostly. And I've spent time down there with foresters walking a lot of that ground, and the understory is mostly balsam fir, red maple, some hemlock, not a lot of oak. You know, if you want oak, you need to do somewhat more drastic things. You know, there's fire involved and larger openings, and that's not happening down there. So part of this process is, especially if oak is a more heat and drought resistant species, we don't want to lose the oak we have down there. We probably want more of it as time goes by. So one of the things they're talking about is, you know, how do we educate landowners about, they love this oak forest they have. Well, how do you keep it as time goes by?
Could we turn to Jereme now and get his summary, and then we can go back to questions and answers? That was a great capsule there.
That was,
Peter.
And there's a lot of stuff on the Maine website. I just started to read it, but there's, you know, the sewer report is there and a bunch of other reports. So, you know, have at it, everybody, because there's lots of great reading there. That was great, Peter. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jereme, do I need to share? I might need to.
If you want to just keep it conversational and I can just sort of refer to my slides and talk, or do you all want to see my slides?
We want to see your slides. Just made you a co-host.
All right. Let's see. I have to remember how to do this. I'm looking forward to getting early to remember how to share everything here. Let's see. Berlin. Share. I need to see if I remember how I project it so that let's see. Okay, let me try this. Slideshow from beginning. How do I reverse this so that I'm not sharing yet, am I?
Oh, yeah.
I am sharing. Yeah, how do I reverse this? Anybody know?
Go to display settings at the top, Jereme.
Yeah.
And you should be able to switch which screen looks at what. So.
Well, presenter view and slideshow. Now you should just be seeing a slide with a picture of a tree, right? That says Maine forest projections and no notes.
Yeah, we're seeing that screen.
Okay. So yeah, this is it. There are going to be a lot of similarities to what I'm doing to what Peter just described. we're also, well, we've been exploring a couple of different methods for doing projections, and one of those uses wood stock, and one of those just grows it out using Aaron Weiskittle's FVS, the Acadian variant, and does projections that way. So we're looking at projecting out, probably mainly just focusing on the next 30 years or so. So Maine Forest projections 2018 to 2048. You know, this is going to definitely share similarities to what was done with the 4 Maine project, and my other major template is the work that Todd Caldwell did, which Ken referred to, the timber supply outlook. So, you know, this isn't statute, so why are we doing this? It's directed by statute. You know, among other things, we're required to conduct a forest inventory, and we do that in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service. So, you know, we had the periodic inventory. 1995 was a periodic inventory. I think it was 1982, 1971, and I think there was another one or two before that. In 1999, we switched over to the annual inventory. So the first cycle of the annual inventory was completed in 2003. And then we've got cycles going forward, 2008, 2013, 2018. The other directive is to do timber supply modeling. The director shall coordinate efforts to project future timber supply using forest models based on growth, harvest, and other dynamic factors affecting the forest. The model must allow for statewide projections and projections for geographic regions and landowner classes. So this work will all fall under that. There are additional directives to determine demand for timber resources. This work and whatever we end up publishing on the short term will mostly focus on supply and getting at demand, and a myriad of other factors will be for future years. Why else are we doing this? We anticipate a wide variety of questions from the public, from interest groups, from the legislature. Questions will and are revolving around the economy. These questions will likely not just be limited to timber supply, but the resource as a whole. So I think, you know, of course, carbon's a big question right now. So I'll be certainly looking at volumes and inventory over time, but also looking at how carbon is expected to change. This is the initial timber supply report. This is the figure that Ken showed.
Hey, Jeremy?
Yeah.
We can't, we're still on the first slide with the blue tree.
Shoot.
Can you go back to the, whatever you had before? Adam, can you help get him back to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it froze. Jeremy, stop sharing and try sharing again. I think it's probably
Okay.
where we're at.
All right.
Okay, now we got it.
Oh, now you got it. Okay.
Don't touch
Well, I
it.
know my new
slide
job
below,
now
okay.
can be IT. So
Yeah. All right. Well, they were all text slides anyway, so you didn't miss too much. So here we are, timber supply outlook for Maine 1995 to 2045. Is that what you see now?
Got it. We do.
Okay, good. Okay, and so these are the projections that Ken showed for their base run and their improved yield run inventory. So again, we have the statute. You know, these are kind of some things that I pulled out of the report. They recognize many diverse uses, but only addressed wood supply. I think we want to start really thinking about other items besides just wood supply, carbon, and other factors. There's a basis for continued work to address statewide standards for forest sustainability. There was a cooperative project between the U.S. Forest Service, the Maine Forest Service, and the same thing applies this time. We're working closely with the U.S. Forest Service on this, and we've created a technical review team, about 13 people. I think I counted maybe 7 people that are on your list, not all here today, that are actually on our technical review team, and I think we've identified 3 or 4 others as reviewers. There's a lot of overlap between your group and our group. The report was an important first step in answering questions about Maine's forests. MFS continues to collect new data on Maine's forest condition through annual inventory in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service. So again, I mean, I think we're kind of building up a modeling system right now, and this, whatever we end up producing on the short term here, will probably have to be seen as a first step to maybe help guide questions. And as we continue to do this, I really do hope that we don't just keep saying, well, all models are wrong, but some are useful, that we can start to develop some really good ideas about what we think works and what doesn't work, and maybe put it in the context of uncertainties and things like that as we move forward. So hopefully I'll have the opportunity to continue to redevelop the model and improve the model as we go forward. Like I said, I think I told Lloyd and Ken knows, but we really can't be showing any projections just yet until I think the technical review team has vetted the results. But I think looking at some of the past and present results, what's already published in the FIA database or available in eValidator is fair to talk about a little bit. And these are just put a couple slides in here to maybe help with discussion, but a lot of this stuff you've probably all seen. I think a lot of you are familiar with the FIA data. But looking at land area, we only see a slight decline in the land area, less than 1% over the last 20 years or so. Maybe some forest type groups shrinking a little bit. You see the aspen group maybe declining a tiny bit, but mostly holding pretty steady. I look at the 1995 data, part of the periodic inventory, and there are often what would appear to be some pretty large differences between what you see there and what you see starting in 2003. And I do wonder if that's a function of the data at all. I really try to keep most of my work from 2003 going forward, or the cycle ending in 2003 going forward. But it is useful to look at some of the historic data sometimes. Covers that. Looking at biomass and volume tracks pretty similarly. We saw the biomass increasing over the last 20 years or so. I think largely a large explanation being the response from the spruce budworm outbreak, 1995 kind of bottoming out. And then you can see the spruce fir group kind of increasing in terms of inventory here. Maybe slowing down a little bit in the last few years, but probably a little too soon to say. Again, this data works best when you look at it in 5-year increments, keeps better statistical validity. So, the 2018 report will be due out soon and show an increase between 2013 and 2018. And then we'll continue to track how it's progressing in the upcoming years. I think that removals increased slightly in the last year, according to the FIA data. It'll be interesting to see what removal levels are in 2020 and 2021.
Jeremy, could I ask a question here?
Yeah.
And just to clear up in my own mind, because of Jake Metzler, I've been looking at the data for the harvest of the last biomass and all the harvest. And I thought the biomass harvest has been sort of dropping off over the last 5 years or so. Maybe Jake, help me if I'm misspeaking. So this is not the harvest. This is the...
No, this is the harvest. This is the inventory here.
Gotcha. Just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
And Ken can help me out here, but I think important is when you're looking at the removals and all of the change components, I think they're a little bit lagged because we're looking at a difference between the evaluation ending in, say, 2013 and the evaluation ending in 2018. So sometimes you end up with some things that when you look at the inventory and try to rationalize that against the removals and net growth and things like that, they aren't always going to line up. So that was a question that came up at our last technical review meeting there. So what else? Actually, these forest type groups, we've got forest type groups, we've got the fiber type groups. There are a bunch of different grouping systems out there, and You know, in my work so far, I've been trying to focus more on volume of individual species going out across time. Lloyd kind of asked me a question when we talked, and he was kind of getting at how I'd characterize the forest or stands or averages across stands and things like that. And Ken talked about different stratifications, and of course we're going to be talking about tracking things by mega regions, ownership classes. I look at the stand size classes at the start, reserve status, all of these things. There's a number of other factors that I track across time. I use physiographic classes and site class codes, just kind of an estimate of the growth that FIA puts on the stand of their maximum growth potential to help calibrate the models where it's undergrowing or overgrowing, and group my stands that way as I go through calibration exercises. But these forest type groups, I think a lot of people are used to seeing the forest type groups. I don't know if they're the best for Maine though, considering that, you know, we probably want to be breaking out spruce from fir, breaking out our sugar maples from our red maples, yellow birch from white birch, and the fiber type groups do that. So at this point, I'm kind of tracking those, and at some point, I kind of want to do a deep dive and look at forest type groups and different stocking algorithms and things like that. And I think Lloyd might have sent me something. Others of you might have other ideas about how these things get grouped and classified. So it's something that's of interest to me. So some of the questions we want to get at here with the future resources: how will the forest resource change, assuming current conditions and harvest practices, with various harvest levels and prescriptions, with a severe spruce budworm outbreak, with climate change, with increased hemlock mortality due to hemlock woolly adelgid, with invasive species migration after considering dare browse, under changing development pressures and with changing markets, and on and on. You know, I'm trying to build capacity. I think the things that we'll address with some, to some level, and in the actual modeling framework is varied harvest levels and prescriptions. And the severe spruce budworm outbreak is something that I've done a little bit of work on. You know, in terms of climate change, the Acadian variant of FES, working with Aaron, I was they do a little bit of a look at changing these climate site index in there and seeing how projections might change with that. But I don't think we're ready to really start doing any real projections on climate change yet. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to really understand or to find good ways to parameterize our models in terms of how many acres will, you know, succumb to, you know, different disturbances due to wind or fire or things like that. That's a big question. So we're kind of, a lot of these are discussion points. A lot of these are kind of sidebars. The Forest Service gives estimates of how much the hemlock resource might be reduced in terms of basal area over time. So we can talk about these things, but probably won't really build those into our Woodstock model. And so I've been using a combination of the open stands model, which is Chris Henniger uses that model, and it's a growth and yield model, and the Acadian variant of FES, which is another growth model. I mean, all of these share so many similarities with the base FES that the Forest Service puts out, which is the U.S. Forest Service Northeast variant. So that's a starting point for a lot of this. Aaron has worked to develop the Acadian variant here, and then Chris Henniger actually uses a lot of what Aaron has and took what Aaron has in R and put it in C#. And so it has a lot of the same functionality as the Forest Service version to do treatments and things like that. So I've migrated to the open stands model. We'll use Woodstock to examine different scenarios under various constraints. I mean, there is an optimization function there. There's a pretty simple, you know, it's normally maximizing or minimizing inventory given different harvest levels to just play out some different scenarios, or it's maximizing harvest to under, allowing the inventory to decline a little bit or keeping it steady. So those are the treatments are pretty simple in my model right now. They're light intensity removals or heavy intensity removals, and in Woodstock you can kind of constrain things so that certain numbers of acres get harvested once you meet certain basal area thresholds and things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility in Woodstock, and which makes it a pretty good platform for doing this. We talked a lot about whether or not we really even needed Woodstock to do this. I think as we talked a little bit earlier, this is a simulation problem. It's kind of what if scenarios, but it's useful for doing quick trade-off analyses and things like that. Let's see, so part of my method is to take the FIA data, I'll grow it out from 2003 to 2018 and verify how well it does in terms of growth and mortality. If necessary, I'll recalibrate the models. Maybe the recalibrations will wait. And then I'll take that 2014 to 2018 set of the evaluation of FIA plots and grow that forward out about 50 years, but really we're going to just truncate any results and look at things out to 2048. So that's all I have for now. I figured you'd all have a lot of questions, so we should keep it short.
Jereme, it's
Longer than I thought. Sorry. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned Todd Caldwell's work early on, and that was the basis of it. That was an interesting example of, and Todd was working in the Forest Service, was working with the tools that they had. It came from the Forest Service. That's a simulation. So it was a very conservative output of what we could do because it was just a spreadsheet exercise versus an optimization, like if you're using Woodstock. So that's a really interesting data point right there.
This is Sai. I've got a question, or a couple of questions. One is, are you generating production in tons, tons per acre or that sort of thing, or are you doing it volume? That's one question.
Yeah, right. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead and answer that one.
Oh, okay. Right now I'm keeping everything. I'm trying to keep everything as close as I can to the FIA data as I can. So, I mean, they have ton estimates in FI data. I guess so I'm kind of presenting everything right now in terms of cubic feet.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's how I'm doing it right now. I do think I need at some point to probably try to figure out how I translate these estimates to somehow do a crosswalk between what you see in the FIA data and what you see in the wood processor reports. And that's some stuff I've done a little bit, so yeah.
Right, and there's also the whole question of carbon is really based on tons. So having that information would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, well, so I guess, yeah, if we talk about, the FIA method for carbon, it would be the component ratio method, which would start with the FIA volumes and use the component ratio method to kind of expand out to get biomass. So it's pretty easy to move between the FIA estimates of cubic feet to the FIA estimates of carbon using the methods that are in the component ratio method. I mean, so carbon's just half of the biomass. So that works pretty well in that regard. I don't know if, your group, are you looking at statewide estimates or anything like that? And how do you, if you're looking at, say, like harvester report green tons and making assumptions about statewide carbon there, crosswalking back with some?
Well, this is about inventory. This is, and they're pretty well understood that, if you just take the cubic feet, then that's the commercial cubic feet. So you can almost double that for the biomass of the tree. And then in tons. And so there are well-known sort of rules of thumb, if that sounds crude, to go from commercial cubic feet to actual tons within that organism. Those are fairly well understood.
Okay.
Then the other question becomes this optimization thing, and everybody's talking about optimizing dollars or optimize. There was a question about, are you growing pulpwood? Nobody's running a model to grow pulpwood. You grow good trees and then you decide what it is later. But with the models, you can optimize on anything you want. You can optimize on bird habitat. You can optimize on virtually anything if you can develop a yield curve to go along with different management scenarios. So I think it's a little, that needs to be added into the possibility of optimization, that you can optimize on other things besides money and volume and dollars, all of which are very important, but you can optimize on other things if you choose to, if you have the yield curve.
Sure.
Well, good. I think we have had a good discussion as we went. We got people introduced to each other. We have a sense of what some of the key actors are doing and what they're planning on doing. And we are very close to our usual closing time. We had wanted to give John a couple of minutes to, I guess, pose some other topics that we could address in upcoming sessions, and also see if we can get a sense of, would we like to have an early December meeting, or is it time to take a break until the new year? And so, John, would you just sort of take it from here on those points?
Okay, so what is it? It's the 18th of November. So I guess I think we could fit in one more in December. Yeah, if you need to go, but we're going to try to sort out our future here for a second. I think we could fit in one more in December. It depends on what do we want to hear about. So I guess I'd like to know from I've got a bunch of topics here that I'd like to hear about, but I don't want to preempt anything. So are there any particular topics people would like to know more about that this group that Lloyd and I could facilitate for you? Because that's kind of what we're up to, just learning together. Any topics? I'm going to write them down as you speak. Danny, I'm writing down biomass because I know you want to say that. Or if we run out of topics, we can disband. That's fine too. It's no law says we have to keep going.
I would second the biomass discussion because there's so much information and misinformation about this. I was looking at a fire the other day. Somebody was burning a brush pile and it was producing a lot of smoke. And I went through my mind, I said, which is actually better from a carbon standpoint? Because basically complete combustion, where you're producing carbon dioxide and water, is that more harmful because of the carbon dioxide, or is it better to have somewhat incomplete combustion, where you wind up with a bunch of smoke, but you also wind up with charcoal and other things? And the smoke itself are little particles that are not carbon dioxide. So kind of an interesting little thought was floating through my head, but I would like to have some expertise to talk about. And John, you did this with that famous Massachusetts study. This question of—
I had nothing to do with that, but go ahead.
Right. Anyway, this question of what do you actually generate? And it's fascinating for me to see that Europe has really decided that burning wood is a better alternative. And they're not backpedaling. They're not saying, oh, it isn't the best thing. They've decided. Now they may change their minds, but it's a very valid topic.
It is a valid topic. And I think we should take it on, and we should be very careful and thoughtful about it because it is so complicated. And I don't want to make things worse for everybody. So, and I do kind of know how to get a grip on the dimensions of it, even if I can't speak about it myself. So that's good. Biomass. More topics before I share a few from me.
How can we kill more deer?
Let's see. Has that got to do with climate change? I know as a result of
A
it.
lot.
Well,
It's got a lot to do with it.
well, I
Got a
know
lot to
it's,
do with ticks, Lyme.
well, yeah, that's true, but we need to stop the climate from changing to get that benefit.
John,
Okay,
can I
yes.
ask, I thought we had a list of potential topics, and or maybe it was one of the sessions Lloyd did,
Might have
and you
been,
weren't there if I remember.
yeah, it might have been because I don't have
Just-
that list.
Oh, okay. Lloyd, do
We
you
can
remember that?
find that list and send it around to everybody.
Why don't
Yeah,
we?
that might, I mean, I think the biomass is a good one. But we're reinventing the wheel. We might say, oh, I forgot that was on the list. That was really good. So we could
Right.
just take a look at that and vote or something.
I'll tell you what, let Lloyd, can you dig that up and we can share that in the next day or so?
Yep.
What I might do is send out it's really easy to send out a Google form that you all
good
can
idea.
kind of vote. I list all the things and everybody can pick your favorite two or something. And that'll kind of guide us towards what we do in the coming months.
Let's
And
pick
Adam
a
just sent
day
it
if we can. Say the
Yeah,
first
I
Wednesday.
found one of Lloyd's random emails which had a list. Whether or not it's the
Oh, there you go.
most recent list, I'm not sure.
Well, can you save Lloyd the trouble and forward that to me, Adam?
It's in the
Put
chat.
he put in the
So-
chat.
yeah, okay.
I'll forward it to you as well.
You have
Okay.
it, John.
I got it.
Does someone have a calendar? What's the first Wednesday in December?
I got a calendar. The first Wednesday is the 2nd. That's too soon.
Okay, then
That's my view.
following the 9th, December 9th,
9th
for everybody.
9th, 16th. Probably nobody wants the 23rd. So 9th or 16th.
None of us are allowed to go anywhere, so maybe the 23rd works.
Well, that's true
Good
too.
point.
How about the 25th? I mean, might as well go all
Yeah,
out.
there you go.
That's right.
We're not doing anything else.
Yeah,
I'll bring the cookies.
How about the 16th? That gives us a little more time to set up whoever's appropriate and get the survey out and that sort of thing.
Okay, great.
4 to
Sure.
5:30 kind of thing. Yeah, we'll stick with the Wednesdays, 4 to 5:30.
Good.
That's great. And okay, so you'll be hearing
Well,
from us
Thanks
and
to our,
we'll get some.
thanks to
input.
our presenters. We appreciate you folks joining up.
That was great. That was really
Yeah, that was great.
Before,
Thank you very much.
before Peter leaves, I have one question about the Maine modeling. That was, you said 2 to 3 million tons per year over existing inventory, not use, right?
No,
Of
2 to
this-
3 million tons per year over existing consumption.
Over existing
Right.
consumption.
For example, with spruce fir, we're consuming about 3 million tons per year, and we could theoretically consume an additional 3 million tons per year and be sustainable. That's a
Okay.
big number. We're not going to do that, but we have surplus fiber to work with.
Yeah, well, and the reason that I ask is back to what John's alluded to a little bit about looking at what has been harvested, and I don't want this to devolve everybody leaving, but that we are exporting a lot more spruce fir than we're processing here in Maine.
Good point. We took that into account.
Okay, and so it's all of what the landowners are cutting. It's 2 or 3 million over that, as opposed to what the mills in Maine are using.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you for bringing that up because I forgot to mention it.
So in
Right.
relation to volume that's available, at one point, we had a consultant come and look at the state of Maine and all of the stuff we were using for wood, and they told us we were a bunch of fools because there was all this softwood available. It was called white cedar, and we just were ignoring it. So.
Oh.
Anyway, that's
All right.
that's sometimes what you get from consultants.
Okay, I'll just end by saying I don't want to be the only one on this call that lives through 2 budworm outbreaks. I just don't want to live that long. That's not right. So let's not have another budworm. I don't want to see 2 of them. Right, Ken? So
I didn't want to be that dire, John. I just didn't want to be employed through 2 of them.
through 2.
I don't want the budworm to kill me.
Yeah,
Uh,
you can have a more lofty and philosophical view of the matter. If you're out of
Yeah, I mean, if you
there.
look at state inventory, it was fascinating because there was this big outbreak. There was the budworm in the 17s and 18s. So through the 20s, it was pretty rough. Along came the Depression when they stopped cutting wood, and so the spruce reduced it. So the spruce for inventory just ballooned. Then along came World War II, So you came into the 50s with this burgeoning inventory of spruce fir. That was amazing.
Okay, our historian will conclude the meeting for us. Cy Balch, thank you, sir. Okay, we'll be in touch,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Good to see
Happy
you.
Thanksgiving.